As you know, we've talked about before, humans are a very groupish species. We are much more cooperative than many of our, evolutionary relatives, like the other great apes. We live in groups that would drive a chimpanzee crazy. They can't deal with hundreds of other members of their own species around, stress them to the point of a heart attack. But humans can find ways to work together. So for now, let's focus on some of the choices that we make, pushed by the social situation to choose to work with other people for common goals or to work against them. Just because we can get along doesn't mean we always will get along. There are, resources, we divide them up. If you and I disagree about who gets what, that's where competition comes in. All right, so we're going to start by looking at some situational variables that influence your decision to help or to act in a selfish way. Then we're going to connect this topic to the study of moral cognition. How does morality influence our decision to work with others or not? And then we're going to look at one particular part of morality, which is our sense of fairness or our sense of justice. So let's go on. All right. First of all, why does conflict happen? We have to recognize that when there are a limited number of resources, then there are perceived reasons to fight and real reasons to fight. When there are limited resources, you may be dealing with realistic group conflict. That occurs when people are divided into different groups and there's limited resources, so you have to decide who gets what. So competition comes from who gets access to the food, who gets access to the farmland, or so on. But it's not all about realistic conflict because what psychologists have found is that humans will fight over resources even if there's no need to. Sometimes it's not enough for us to split this 50-50. I want 60% of the resources, or I want 70% of the resources, either as an individual or as a group. So, focusing on group conflict, why might some groups start a competition, start fighting or warfare or whatever, even if there's enough to share? Well, there's some easy cognitive explanations, such as in-group favoritism. In-group favoritism is that psychological tendency we have. We are biased toward our own group. However you define what group you're a part of, you tend to like them more, you want them to be successful, and all these positive things that can make you selfish at the group level. This is compounded by the fact that, as we've discussed, humans form group identities so quickly. We quickly get attached to people, we want to see them doing well, and so we will fight for them to get more than other people. This is aided by this tendency we have to stereotype members of groups that we're not a part of. It is this outgroup homogeneity effect. The outgroup homogeneity effect is when we recognize that members of our own group are all individuals with different personalities and different traits, but we see the outgroup as homogenous, meaning we view them as, oh, they're all the same, and we're more likely to view them as having negative traits. So when we're competing with another group, it's this chicken and egg effect where when you're competing with another group, you're more likely to stereotype them with negative stereotypes. Now, I'll give an example here from Zarate et al., where they connected this realistic group conflict approach with what's known in psychology as the stereotype threat matching approach, which is the finding that our stereotypes about groups that we're not a part of match the resources we're competing with for those groups. For example, there are stereotypes in the United States about immigrants being hardworking and be willing to take jobs that maybe others don't want to take. But what's interesting is that historically speaking, we only have these stereotypes about immigrants. It doesn't matter where the immigrants are coming from. That's not where those stereotypes come from. It matters what time period you're in and whether there is economic insecurity. So when, for example, in the US, when Americans are fighting for jobs because jobs are scarce, our stereotypes about immigrants coming in being very hardworking and taking our jobs gets more prominent. But in times when jobs are plentiful, suddenly those stereotypes about immigrants who are hardworking and want to take our jobs don't seem as important to people. They're not ascribed to the immigrants coming in. So it appears that part of where our stereotypes about other groups comes from is the situation we find ourselves in. We view them as more hardworking and wanting to take jobs, not because of something they did, but because of economic insecurity we're experiencing. Now, notice I'm going to point out here and several times in the presentation that our view of the outgroup can be based on reality, right? It might be true that immigrants coming in are very hardworking, but our stereotypes are often based on a mix of reality and our perceptions of that group, whether it's based on reality or not. So we've already talked about ways that we can stereotype people that are not part of our group to kind of justify our negative feelings towards them. What's a way that you can reduce conflict between groups? Well, in general, when you see things in common between members of your own group and other groups, you are more likely to cooperate with them than to compete with them. So when you see differences between you and whoever you think of as them, your negative attitudes are more likely to increase. This goes both ways. So maybe you start out with negative attitudes, which causes you to discriminate against a group, but your discrimination against a group can also cause you to have prejudices and stereotypes. So we use prejudices and stereotypes as a way, self-justification, as a way to justify our behavior toward people. This process can begin from not a desire to hate on another group of people, but self-interest for our own group members. Bobo, for example, reanalyzed data and historical records about bus boycott campaigns by members of the white community in the United States and found that a big predictor of whether people supported boycotts against integrated buses was self-interest. If it benefited members of the white community, they suddenly became more prejudiced and were more against busing. Our prejudices are often there after our behavior as a way to justify our self-interest or our selfishness toward our own group. When we talk about conflict with others, we have to talk about our sense of morality, because our sense of morality is about rules about when you should help others, when you should avoid harming others. From a social psychologist's perspective, morality, our sense of right and wrong, serves a social functional purpose. That means that just like anger serves the purpose of motivating your body in fight or flight to solve certain problems you might encounter, morality motivates your body into a certain state to help you solve certain problems. Our sense of right and wrong governs how we interact with other members of our species and our environment, and it has at least two different purposes. One is our sense of morality serves an individual purpose. If different members of a community all have a shared sense of morality about it's wrong to hurt others, it's wrong to cheat others, and so on, that protects you as an individual, because living in a community where you know people won't hurt you for no reason or hurt you purely out of selfishness, right? That's against the rules. That is helpful at an individual level. But morality also serves a group function. And this may be one of those hidden connections between why humans have such advanced moral systems. We appear to have very advanced moral cognition compared to most things on the planet. We also live in larger communities than most things on the planet. So morality's social function at a group level is to bind communities together, because individuals working separately are often not able to complete the projects and get the resources and protect themselves as efficiently as groups working together. So when groups working together, the social capital of the community increases. By binding communities together, we can work as a functioning unit so we can more effectively protect ourselves. Imagine a group of 30 people as individuals come into conflict with a group of 30 people who are working together as a group, as a unit. The group that is working together as a functioning unit will always win. Um, So our sense of morality evolved for both of these two purposes. There are a couple different theories about morality that I'm going to introduce to you here. One from the anthropologist Richard Schwader, his three ethics. And I'm also going to introduce a social psychological theory, moral foundations theory, which was partially inspired by the work of Richard Schwader and others. So, what anthropologists try to do is find patterns among human cultures. Let's look at human cultures across the planet and see if there are rules in common about how we treat other people. And Schwader and his colleagues found that there was this pattern where he divided these moral rules into three categories: autonomy, divinity, and community. So every culture, according to Schwader, has rules about autonomy. Basically, rules about that you should not infringe upon the autonomy of others except under very specific circumstances. You shouldn't murder someone else because that's harm. That you shouldn't physically harm someone else at all because that is removing their ability to live freely. But every culture on the planet has certain conditions under which it is okay to kill other people. In self-defense, for example, is a common thing. So other things that we find in common with cultures include rules about divinity. Every culture on the planet appears to have some rules about divinity. That's most of the time the same thing as their rules about religion. How best to worship, how best to put the divine in some part of your life in some way. And every culture on the planet believes that there are moral rules regarding divinity. So it's wrong to take the Lord's name in vain, for example. It is wrong to eat certain foods when you're in a temple in certain religions, or it's wrong to eat certain foods at all in other religions. So every culture has rules about divinity. Now, extending into more modern research, we find that even very secular cultures have rules that might fall under this category, because even individuals that are not very religious have rules about spiritual things or non-material things. Would you go, if you imagine you're not religious at all, would you go to a national park and start destroying the wildlife? Most people would say no, even non-religious people. They don't think that destroying wildlife is bad because it is offending God's creation, but they think that preserving the natural world is something we should be interested in, even if it doesn't benefit us directly. So most cultures have rules about divinity. Even less religious cultures still have rules that might fall under this category, more broadly defined in modern research. Finally, all cultures have rules concerning community. How you should treat your elders, for example, how you should treat your family members. Should you treat people in my own tribe differently than people in the other tribe, or, whatever word you have for my group and their group? Every culture on the planet has these social rules concerning how we treat members of our community, these moral rules. And notice that we can divide both this theory and the next one I'll talk about into individual motivating morality and group motivating morality. Because what we find is that most of our rules about divinity, they may not help you as an individual, but they do help glue you to your community. Having a shared set of religious values, even if some of them don't directly benefit you as an individual, they help tie you to a community, right? And obviously, community values are, based on community work as well. All right, going to a more modern social psychology theory based on some of this early work, Jesse Graham, Jonathan Haidt, and a few other psychologists created moral foundations theory by looking even further into, could we find any patterns in how people view morality? Is morality one thing or is it multiple things? And these social psychologists say that there are at least 5 separate things that all fall under the category of moral behavior. But we separate it into 5 because we recognize that being high on one of these values doesn't automatically mean you're high on the other values. You can care a lot about the moral foundation of care while not caring much about loyalty, or vice versa. So these categories are care, which is you should protect other people, you should not harm other people. Fairness is you should treat other people fairly and expect them to treat you fairly. Loyalty is you should show loyalty to certain people. And again, these are present in every culture, but different cultures have different rules about who that extends to. In some areas, for example, loyalty to family, treating family members like you would treat yourself, extends to first and second cousins. It extends to grandparents. It extends very far. In other areas of the world, you should respect your parents, you should respect your siblings, but your ties to other family members outside of that small circle are not as strong. So loyalty looks different in different cultures, but every culture has it. Authority is similar. In every culture, there are rules about who the authority figures are and how you should treat those authority figures. But who they are and how you should treat them differ from place to place and from person to person. For example, where I grew up, my grandparents would have never addressed their own parents by their first name. They would always call people sir and ma'am. My generation, those rules had gotten a little bit more relaxed, but I was still expected to show deference to my parents, right? If I disrespected my parents, I would get in trouble. I didn't have to call them sir and ma'am. It wasn't as strong in our culture today, but still, I have rules growing up about who the authority figures are and how should I treat them. Finally, according to moral foundations theory, we have a place for divinity from the 3 ethics, and that's in sanctity. Every culture, we've renamed it, recognizing that it's not always about the divine. Sanctity is the rules that a culture has about what is sacred and what is profane. That can include religious rules. For example, I shouldn't eat certain foods because God disapproves of eating those foods. That is a moral concern that would fall under sanctity. But I should not contribute to the extinction of endangered animals because animals going extinct is bad for the planet. That may also fall under sanctity, even if you're not a religious person, right? There are things that you feel are sacred, whether they directly impact you or not. Our feelings about sexual behavior also fall under this category of sanctity. It turns out people that have a lot more concern about respecting divine rules, religious rules, tend to have more concerns about policing others' sexual behavior. So more conservative views toward sexual behavior tend to be tied with more conservative views about religion. Not a perfect relationship, and in fact, there's been some attempts by psychologists to try to split the sanctity pillar of moral foundations theory into 2 or even 3 different categories. But there's not been enough evidence to confirm exactly how we should split that category up. So now, I want to take a step back here. I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but point out that psychology in the last 30 years or so has changed the way that we study moral cognition. Because previously, a lot of psychologists studying morality exclusively studied harm-based morality. This is the belief that the moral systems we have in our head are exclusively about the rules we have for when it is okay to hurt other people and when we shouldn't hurt other people. Social conventional morality refers to norms that are seen as appropriate within a culture, but that don't necessarily involve behaviors that relate to doing good or doing harm toward others. So in the past, loyalty, for example, might not have been considered a part of our moral reasoning. Because if I choose, my brother asks me for money and I choose not to loan him money, I'm not harming him. So in the past, we wouldn't have considered that a moral choice at all. But nowadays, we recognize that in most cultures, rules about how and when you should assist family members fall under our moral reasoning, right? We think about them in the same ways that we think about, is it okay to hurt someone else? Is it okay to cheat someone else? Is it okay to be just disrespectful toward my religious elder figure or my older brother, for example? All of these engage our moral reasoning. So we have a more nuanced view of morality today. So we've got these theories about morality, and we find similar moral concerns across different cultures all over the planet, but that doesn't address where do these moral concerns come from, because there's, several different explanations that could be true. One is that because humans across the planet all encounter similar issues, we came up with similar solutions. Well, another is that happened enough that we evolved these cognitive tendencies. But another explanation is that different cultures all developed similar responses to these problems. So is it culture? Is it evolution? As always, my answer is that it's a mix of the two. We see that other species, not just humans, have similar moral concerns to us. Not the same, but similar. There's a great video on TED.com or YouTube, Moral Behavior in Animals, by Frans de Waal, where he talks, and then there's a video he shows showing how other species react when they notice something being unfair. Humans are not the only species that cares about fairness. So our concerns for morality, not hurting other people, being fair towards other people, having a hierarchy that we adhere to, authority concerns, are found in so many other species. They probably all have deep roots in our evolutionary history. But humans also have much more advanced cultural transmission of behavior than other species, right? So we also have social fairness norms, beliefs about how people should be treated, what is considered fair. And our social fairness norms differ from culture to culture. People in the US, for example, prefer to give out resources based on merit instead of need. But we suspend those beliefs when groups are in great need, such as when thinking about an economic depression. In one particular study by Berman, and Singh, they compared Indians to Americans and found that both groups in general think that you should allocate resources based on merit. So who puts in the most work gets the most result as a part of that. But although Indians showed the same pattern, they considered need more than Americans as compared to merit. So different groups have different rules. There's some similarities, there's some differences. Here I want to introduce two vocab words, equity versus equality. And I was at a talk a few years ago and I heard the metaphor to explain them that I think is one of the best ones I've heard, which is think at bathrooms at a crowded concert. Equality means there are equal number of bathrooms with an equal number of stalls in each. But equity means that the number of bathrooms, the number of stalls is proportionate to the group of people that are using them. So, as he pointed out at the talk, I don't know if this is true. This is an empirical question, but let's imagine it's true that people tend to take longer in the women's bathrooms than they do in the men's bathrooms. So, at a concert venue, if you had equal bathrooms, both women's and men's would have the same number of stalls. But equitable bathrooms, the women's restrooms would have more stalls than the men's restrooms would have, locations. That kind of explains the difference between equality and equity. Now, this is related to the terms of distributive fairness and procedural fairness that we need to go over. Distributive fairness is based on our perceptions of equity. We believe that each person should share a portion of the resources based on how much they contributed. Distributive fairness is we should provide assistance to people based on the proportion of how much need that those people have. Procedural fairness refers to beliefs about the fairness of the procedures we use to give out resources. So in thinking about things from distributive fairness viewpoint, we view it as unfair if two people put in the same work, but one gets paid more. An issue in procedural fairness would be we view it as unfair if two people commit the same crime, but one gets more punishment because they should go through the same legal procedure and get the same result if they had the same crime. It's possible to have more distributive fairness and procedural fairness and then be out of sync with each other in particular issues. Let's talk about the ways that groups or individuals respond when the world is not viewed as fair. The world is not viewed as adhering to the rules of who should get what resources. Now, there is a trait that's been labeled just world beliefs or belief in a just world that psychologists use. That is the name for believing that the world is a place where good people have good outcomes, bad people have bad outcomes. Now, on the surface, that sounds like it could be a good thing. Just world beliefs look like they are, it sounds like a good thing to believe that people in power deserve their power. People that are disadvantaged deserve their disadvantages. Okay, now you're seeing where things can get more complicated because belief in a just world can include individuals that believe that those that are suffering have done something to deserve their suffering, which can cause them to put beliefs on the people who are victims, like victim blaming, which is when we assign people that have been the victim of something more blame for being in their situation, regardless of whether their actions actually put them in that situation or not. People that have higher just world beliefs, for example, assume that AIDS victims are more to blame for their condition. People with higher just world beliefs are also more likely to blame sexual assault victims for being victimized. Now, again, being higher in just world beliefs makes you more likely to engage in this victim blaming, whether or not there's any real justification behind your beliefs. Now, if it's pretty horrible, I think, hearing about a sexual assault victim and kind of automatically assuming she must have done something to deserve it sounds pretty bad. Why do people engage in these just world beliefs like victim blaming? Part of the explanation is that it helps individuals resolve cognitive dissonance. Remember, cognitive dissonance is when you're aware of two things or have two attitudes that conflict with each other. So if you believe that the world is a place where good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, but you hear about a bad thing happening to a good person, like someone you know who's a good person that has an AIDS diagnosis in the 80s when it was a death sentence. Not that it's a lot better today, but in any case, Cognitive dissonance occurs when you hear about bad things happening to good people. One way to reduce that cognitive dissonance, I don't think a good way, but one way that it can be done, is to adjust your beliefs to believe that the people that were hurt deserved that hurt in some way. Now, related to this is another trait that we call social dominance orientation. Social dominance orientation is the degree to which you are comfortable with some groups in society dominating other groups in society. Dominating, in this case, dominance, refers to having greater economic or social power. So people with high social dominance orientation, when they hear about some groups in the US having greater social power than others, they're comfortable with that. They're okay with that situation. We'll talk in another lecture about research when we go into prejudice and discrimination, that in some parts of the country, we do have data to support that Black and white Americans, even when they're committing the same crimes, Black Americans can be killed disproportionately by the police or incarcerated more often by the police, even when performing the same actions as white offenders. Now, if you are comfortable with that scenario I just described to you, where two groups, even though they're engaging in the same actions, because of the social power of one of those groups, they're being punished less for it, that's an indication you might be higher in social dominance orientation. Now, it's not just members of the dominant group that can be high or low in social dominance orientation. Members of the group with lower status can be high in social dominance orientation as well. Members of a group with low social power that has high social dominance orientation thinks it's acceptable that their group has lower social power. This is a little bit different than the acceptance of your low status as part of, a normal and functioning society, which we've called false consciousness. Now, acceptance of your belonging to a low status group does not necessarily mean that you think that's the right way for society to be organized. How do you react if you are a member of a group that has low social power? Well, there are a couple reactions that psychologists have studied. One is the focus on the creativity of individuals from minoritized groups or groups with lower social power. We often find that their culture tends to reflect their unique cultural strengths and heritage. So they find ways to focus on what makes their culture strong, and they take pride in that. Now, okay, that's one way to react to being of low social status. You can take pride in what makes your culture unique. Another thing is taking collective action. This is when a group engages in behaviors to try to increase their status or power in a society when they feel like power is not balanced properly. The Occupy Wall Street movement that happened around 10 years ago now in the United States was when groups of protesters organized to try to advocate for greater economic equality in the United States. Collective action can refer to protests, it can refer to more extreme measures, typically groups that if peaceful protests don't work, some groups can transition to non-peaceful, violent protest, depending on certain conditions. Not only does engaging in collective action, it could possibly result in gaining social power for your group, but it also is a way to boost a group's sense of identity, which can increase positive feelings by identifying with the group that you're taking collective action with. All right, we know that morality is moral cognition, strategies we use to avoid hurting each other, to build up communities, to build up resources. But we still haven't, we need to go back and talk about how exactly, when we have shared resources, do we decide, am I going to keep these resources for myself or am I going to share with the group? Because even if we do have that tendency to want to cooperate with others, You still need to be a little bit selfish to get your needs met and a little bit non-selfish to contribute to the group. So we'll talk about public goods, how we define social dilemmas. We'll also go over some specific tools called economic games that psychologists, economists, and others use to try to measure and compare how selfish different individuals are from different cultures. Finally, we will talk about some of the individual differences and cultural differences in how people from different cultures respond on those economic games. So what is a public goods dilemma? Public goods are benefits shared by a community at large that everyone in the group has access to. Now, when you have a situation where there is a public resource, be it, food in a forest that everyone can hunt, farmland that everyone can use, a collective water source that everyone needs to survive, this creates a public goods dilemma because you as a community have to decide, how are we going to share these resources? Humans are very good at avoiding the solution of, well, we could just fight all the time over these resources. That is not an efficient way to handle things, and humans try to avoid that. But what do we do when we have these public goods dilemmas? For a long time, psychologists and philosophers viewed this as kind of a fundamentally unsolvable problem. But nowadays, partially due to the work of Elinor Ostrom, an economist, and other people, we view that there are several stable solutions to this problem. None of our solutions work in every single circumstance, but they work under specific circumstances. Elinor Ostrom, she won her Nobel Prize in part for outlining 8 different principles of effective use of public goods. I want to connect some of her principles with stuff we've learned in our social psychology class, like number 4, effective monitoring by people who are accountable. Well, this connects with stuff we've learned about how when your behavior is publicly visible by others, it changes. We become a little bit more honest. Sometimes we adhere better to social norms, maybe social norms about how public goods are distributed. Number 6, mechanisms of conflict resolution are cheap and easy to access. As we've discussed throughout the class, your brain is an accuracy versus efficiency machine. It's always trying to find accurate solutions to problems that are very efficient. They use the least resources possible. By providing a community with conflict resolution mechanisms that they can easily get to, it makes your brain more likely to think, let's go use that conflict resolution strategy. Number 7, self-determination of the community is recognized by higher level authorities. Humans respond very well to authority from above. We won't get into the others, but what we recognize now is that, yes, humans can very easily share resources with each other, but for it to be stable, for there to be less conflict, we have to have certain situations to stabilize how we are allocating resources. Let's talk about some more of the variables. In general, on the public goods dilemma or other dilemmas, by pushing people's cognition farther into the future, you get more cooperation and less selfish behavior. So when people are focused on surviving in the short term, they're more likely to be impulsive and selfish. But when they're thinking about surviving in the long term, they recognize that in the long term, being selfish can hurt the group, which can hurt their chances in the future, because in the future, having a group that is supportive of you is better in the long term. I think we also mentioned that when behavior is publicly visible, we become less selfish. Looking at a cross-cultural difference, places that have a higher degree of market integration tend to be more selfish. This is, at this point, most of the global Western monoculture that has capitalistic systems, trading using money. When we compare parts of the world that have, used money and these commerce systems for longer in their history, those civilizations tend to be more selfish on the economic games that I'm going to show you in a couple minutes. You might have heard me refer here or in other places to economic games, or maybe I've used just the word games. This is a term that we often use for these stimuli. I'll show you a few examples of these. But what these are little scenarios that we set up. Usually we present this to a participant and they play a round of the game to earn some points or earn some actual money, right? A lot of the experiments that I'm going to talk about while I go through this section give people actual money in exchange for their behavior in the game. So usually you're playing, competing against somebody else. And so if you choose to be selfish, you actually get more money and the other person doesn't. If you choose to be more cooperative or selfless, then you're actually giving money away to somebody else. This is great from a research methods perspective because if we have scenarios with real world stakes, you're actually earning money, we expect that we'll get closer to people's real world choices and behavior. So let's look at a couple of these. Imagine you are matched with a real other person. I'm going to flip a coin and one of you is going to be assigned person A, one of you will be person B. Person A starts with 30 points or maybe 30 cents, Person B starts with 0. Person A then has a choice. You can choose how much of your 30 points you want to transfer to person B. Whatever person A transfers is doubled and given to person B. Person B can then choose how much they want to transfer back to person A, right? So, as you can imagine, this is known as the trust game because it is a measure in part of how much you trust the other people that you're playing with. What we found is that in some cultures, there are higher levels of trust. More rural cultures, less market integrated cultures, they feel comfortable transferring the entire amount to the other person because they trust that they'll get a fair offer back. In places where we find more selfish behavior, people aren't as trusting. They keep more of their points or their money, and they don't trust that the other person is going to be fair in giving it back to them. A classic dilemma is the prisoner's dilemma. Named after, so ignore the names on the slide for a minute, and I'm going to tell you the original scenario it's named after. Imagine that you and someone else are both picked up by the police because you are suspected of a crime. Now, you and your partner know that you did commit the crime, but the police are interrogating you separately. Now, you know that you will spend 5 years in jail if your partner rats you out. But if you both keep your mouth shut, maybe the police are still going to put you both away, but you'll get 3 years in jail, they'll get 3 years in jail. However, if you both rat each other out, you're both going to get 5 years in jail. But you can rat out your partner, say that it was all his idea, it was all his fault, I wasn't really involved. And if you rat him out and he keeps his mouth shut, he's going to get the jail time and you won't. This is why it's named the prisoner's dilemma, because it's based on the scenario where two people get picked up by law enforcement. I want you to imagine, what would you do in this scenario if you and your partner got caught? Would you keep your mouth shut and trust that they are also going to not say anything? Or would you rat out your partner? Would you defect, according to the words on the slide? Would you defect in order to get them in trouble? Often when this is played in a laboratory simulation, we're not actually giving people jail time, but we're giving people maybe a little bit of money or a little bit extra credit or something like that. So maybe if you both choose to cooperate, you'll earn $3. If you both choose to betray each other, you both earn $1. But if I choose to betray my partner and they choose to trust me, I earn $5 and they earn nothing. So again, we find there is individual differences and cross-cultural differences in the prisoner's dilemma. Let's talk about that actually on the next slide. Heinrich and colleagues in 2001, they noticed there was a gap in the literature where a lot of the economic games that we had been testing were tested in some very specific parts of the world, like the United States, for example. Especially a lot of the research they were aware of was happening in the English-speaking world. They thought to themselves, the English-speaking world is not everybody. What if we compare how people from different cultures behave on some of these economic games? So they went to, it was 17 groups in total, representing 15 different small-scale societies, and they had them play these economic games for some real little bits of money, right? What they found is that industrialized cultures tend to reject low offers, but cultures that are less industrialized, that are living more according to their traditional ways before industry and capitalism took over, they rarely reject any offer. They will take whatever their partner gives to them and they view it as a benefit. The general trend is that in smaller scale civilizations where you're encountering less people, you know less people, you're living in smaller towns and villages rather than bigger cities, you're more likely to cooperate with each other and trust each other on these economic games. The variation between small scale societies and large industrialized capitalistic societies, there's a wide gap in behaviors where they make most of the world look selfish. That is one big difference we find. Now, it is a cultural difference, as I've discussed, but there's also an individual difference. Some people tend to be more self-oriented. They engage in more selfish behavior. Are there some other variables that we can predict whether someone will be selfish or not? Under certain circumstances, we find that women tend to be less competitive. Specifically, if we give women the opportunity to help others or help the group in general, they will take resources from other people if it's to help members of their own group, as compared to just being selfish in general. Now, if we give people the opportunity to discuss how they're going to behave in some of these economic games, we find that people's behavior fits into these general 4 categories. If you're very concerned about how much you earn from the scenario, but you're also concerned about how the other person is going to act, so the high concern square on this graphic, people go into more of a problem-solving mode where they try to talk with the other person and reason out what is the optimal solution for us to engage in. If one person is concerned about their own money, but they don't care what the other person thinks, then you might find this contentious strategy where they're argumentative and they're trying to get the most money out of the other person as possible. If they don't care very much about how they make from the economic game, they don't have a lot of stake in it, maybe they don't need the resources, you find this yielding strategy. And if neither person cares, you don't find much discussion at all. They just engage in the game and move on. All right, let's finish off with some more variables that tend to increase or decrease our cooperative behavior. And we'll talk about some communication strategies to increase our ability to cooperate with others. So first of all, in general, people tend to look for cooperative solutions first. So if you want to promote cooperation among groups, you can manipulate the situation by providing people with opportunities to cooperate, right? Providing them with solutions that allow everyone to get their way. Something that's making me think of, previous stuff we've learned in the class, the larger your group size is, the less you're able to cooperate with others. So smaller groups, when they're interacting with each other, tend to have an easier time finding cooperative solutions than larger groups. We see in humanity's history in the last 10,000 years or so, as larger and larger civilizations have dominated, this might be one contributing factor into the competition we see across the planet. Larger groups becomes harder and harder to find solutions, find common ground. Putting people under conditions of uncertainty leads to more competitive biases when you're processing a situation. So what does uncertainty mean, right? If two groups are competing over access to water in an area where they really need the water to survive, if both groups have an accurate idea of how much water is actually present, they're more likely to cooperate. But if nobody's sure when the water is going to run out, nobody's sure if there are alternative locations that can access it, it pushes them to think more competitively. Similarly to something we discussed earlier, if groups are familiar with each other, familiar with the cultural practices, familiar with the individuals, they're more likely to be cooperative. They're more likely to look for solutions that are cooperative. When biologists were first starting to model the evolution of cooperative or selfish behavior, they used a lot of competing computer models, right? They would program in models for certain behavior and have them compete against each other. And it was very clear that one strategy, on average, was winning out. And that strategy is tit for tat. Tit for tat is the name of a reciprocal strategy where you wait for someone else to act first to see if they are going to act selfishly or cooperatively, and then you mimic their choice. So give them an opportunity, and if they are cooperative, you cooperate. If they're cooperative again, you cooperate again. In general, this strategy tends to be better than being purely selfish, which makes other people not want to play with you, or being purely cooperative, which gives you the opportunity to be taken advantage of. So this tit for tat strategy or waiting for reciprocity strategy, it is not perfect. It's still possible to be taken advantage of. If somebody else notices your tit for tat strategy, they can manipulate it to take advantage of you when it's appropriate. But we're talking about computer programs here. In real animal behavior, obviously, we can adjust our behavior as we go along. We still use this similar strategy, though, humans and other organisms. One of our ideal strategies is to want to cooperate with others that we see cooperating with us. This works both for real-world situations and the economic games that we discussed earlier. One way that you can ensure more cooperation on many of those economic game tasks is to let people know they'll be playing several rounds. If people know that they'll be playing several rounds of an economic game with others in a small group, they will be more cooperative because, well, selfishness has a cost. Nobody will help you if they notice you taking all the resources for yourself. Now, keeping that conversation going with connecting some of the things we've discussed to real world situations, a lot of what I've been discussing has been based on in-lab research. But when we take this out into the real world, we find that our decision to cooperate with each other is often more complicated than just how much of 30 cents am I going to donate to somebody else, right? In real world situations, one of the added sources of complexity is communication breakdown. And what we found is that anything to increase communication between groups leads to more cooperation. This falls under three general categories. Negotiation is when two or more groups try to communicate and work together to resolve their differences. Mediation involves creating a compromise using a third party, a mediator. And arbitration is another technique where you use a third party, but they avoid negotiation. An arbitrator chooses a solution for you after being presented with the facts. And both groups have agreed ahead of time to go along with the decision that the arbiter makes. Each of these strategies is appropriate under some circumstances. All right, that's where we'll end it for today. If you want to learn more about any of the specific topics in this presentation, here are our references. I highly recommend the Graham and colleagues article from 2013 on moral foundations theory. If you're interested in how moral behavior evolved in humans, um, if you are interested in kind of cross-cultural research, the Henrik and colleagues article from 2001 is one of my favorite reads. I cite that study in several classes that I teach. But thanks for your attention, everyone.